For now, let's restart the morning meeting. The price of gold, of course, hitting an all-time high in recent days as the dollar continues its drop. Remember when Ben Bernanke and, for that matter, Hank Paulson and now Tim Geithner bailed out the banks. They took all of the risk that the banks created and stuck it inside the U.S. dollar. We've been printing dollars by the trillion. And so the dollar continues to become more and more worthless because we just print it. And the gold markets are rising very rapidly. There's a concern that the Arab states may try to eliminate oil altogether as dollars altogether as a currency for oil. What should you be doing and what should we be doing as we watch the consequences of the Bernanke, Paulson, Geithner bailout bear itself out on the U.S. currency and financial markets? Joining the conversation here, Bill Fleckenstein, the head of Fleckenstein Capital, author of the book Greenspan's Bubbles, The Age of Ignorance at the Federal Reserve. Jonathan Capehart, you can see. Daniel Mitchell, senior fellow at the CATO Institute, a Washington think tank. Bill, what is the greatest risk for people who are not they're not in the markets? What is the greatest risk to this country and to American citizens of allowing the bailout and the money printing the way that we did, and now watching the currency start to erode faster and faster?
Well, the greatest risk is that the green pieces of paper that we call money cease to be considered as any form of value. Historically, for thousands of years, paper currencies always lost their value because governments always, at some point, got out of hand. The consequences of the bailout to save the financial system that you just described, the net result for the average person at home is like this. Pretend everyone has a Monopoly game, and all that Monopoly money you can go out and spend, except for before you get to spend it, you get to add about 4 zeros to it. If everyone did that, then the value of the paper that we already call money would be worth less because more money was created. That's in essence what happened, except for they gave, millions of Monopoly games to certain institutions, and a lot of individuals didn't get any Monopoly games. But the consequences for them will be the same.
Dan Mitchell, senior fellow at the CATO Institute, your thought as to the best course of action for policymakers trying to defend a very vulnerable currency that has now become the warehouse for all of the bad behavior on Wall Street over the past 10 years?
Well, the key thing that should happen is we need to somehow get the Federal Reserve to adopt more of a sound money policy. Here's a little factoid for your listeners. Since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the dollar has lost 95% of its value. Let's at least stop the bleeding right now, and that involves a couple of things. It involves the Federal Reserve being independent from the politicians and not trying to gin up the money supply to help Republicans or Democrats get elected, and they have a bad track record on that. And number two, and this is the practical part of it, we need the Fed to begin to soak up all this liquidity they flooded into the markets over the last year and a half because of the financial crisis. This is what has foreign investors spooked. This is what's driving up the dollar. People don't trust the Fed. They worry we're going to be the next Argentina or, knock on wood, hopefully this isn't true, the next Zimbabwe.
And for those who aren't familiar, Zimbabwe borrowed fortunes largely from South Africa, and then instead of paying the money back, simply devalued it. There's, I think, one of the bills, I have one in my wallet, it's like a $100 billion note or something. You can basically pay back $1 trillion with 10 pieces of paper. If you were to look at the correlation between the banking practices, Bill Fleckenstein, and the unlimited risk they were taking with taxpayer money to bonus themselves, and now the threat to the U.S. currency, what is the overall, in other words, walk us through the national threat of a worthless currency, or a worthless currency.
What in essence happened was we were about to vaporize the financial institutions. So Geithner and Paulson et al., decided to print a lot of money to bail out the financial institutions. This money that's been printed, as you mentioned, in the trillions, now is calling into question the soundness of the dollar and whether or not the Fed will ever mop up the liquidity. They, in all likelihood, won't. So what's going to happen at some point is the dollar will continue to weaken, and in all likelihood, and the risk is at some point, that weakness will preclude the Fed from trying to buy the treasuries that the government's issued. It's a tight little loop where the Federal Reserve is monetizing the debt issued by the Treasury,
right,
and the dollar is weak. At some point, we're going to have trouble funding these deficits, and we'll see higher interest rates forced on us by outsiders, and that'll cause a serious train wreck in the financial markets, though that may be some time off still.
So the big risk is a huge spike in interest rates that has all the obvious impacts. You were going to say something quickly, Dan, then I got to go.
Well, I was simply going to note that in Japan, where deficits and debt are a lot higher than what we have in America, they still have low inflation because their central bank isn't printing the extra money. That's the key thing. Don't print too much money. The Fed has to be responsible with hard money.
Horses out of the barn, Dan. You know as well as I do, the horses out of the barn. The Fed's printing by the trillion. Right. No one's made. We bailed this whole thing out when Ben Bernanke said the limit for me is infinity to support the banks, and he went with the infinity bet, and it saved the financial markets and screwed the dollar.
But we had that same problem in the 1970s, and it turned around under Reagan and Volcker. So just because we've made mistakes doesn't mean we can get back on the straight and narrow.
And that's a critical point, and I'm glad you made it, Dan. There is another way. Thank you. Bill, thank you, Dan. Jonathan, we'll talk to you shortly.